JRPGs are currently more popular now than they've ever been, but that wasn't always the case when it came to Western audiences. There's a variety of reasons for this, with one of the biggest being their often forgotten lack of games that released in Europe back in the day. The 90s in particular was awful for any European fan of the genre. Today we'll be looking at JRPGs that the territory never received when they originally came out, and in some cases have still to this day not been released in PAL territories. But first, a brief bit of history. Europe and Australia is what is considered the PAL region, with Japan and America being known as NTSC-J and NTSC-U regions respectively. It's a little confusing, but these are known as regional codes, and back in the 80s and 90s each territory was region locked from one another, which pretty much refers to whether or not a piece of optical media like DVDs and video games are usable on a specific territory's electronics. You will typically see your country's region code on the front cover of a game or DVD, usually near where the age certificate is located. So the long and short of it is that if you tried putting an American NES game inside of a European NES, it wouldn't read the cartridge and vice versa. This whole topic has a lot to do with how electricity is transferred differently around the world, but is honestly beyond the scope of this video. All you need to know is that when it comes to releasing a video game, specific criteria had to be met in order for them to be compatible for each regional territory. For instance, is the game an NTSC-J copy? Well, that's typically only going to be in the Japanese language only. If it's a PAL copy, it typically has support for multiple language options like English, French and Spanish. Making a game, especially in the 80s and 90s, was a big financial risk given how young the format was, so developers did what they could to prevent losing money. In most instances, this meant not releasing a game in PAL territories. This makes sense when you realise that America has a much larger audience, and translating a game in multiple languages for a much smaller demographic made little to no sense financially back then, especially when you consider how limited resources were, like with translators, and how the internet wasn't what it is today to help with the process. Thankfully, region locks are a thing in the past, but back then, during the pre-public internet days especially, it dictated a lot when it came to a game's global reach. When you factor in the JRPG genre into all this, which usually has a lot of text, in some cases having more than most book series, it makes sense looking back why Japan was very careful when it came to choosing what games to localize in the West and in PAL regions. Okay, now that we know the why behind all this happening in the first place, let's take a look back at the JRPGs Europe originally missed out on. Dragon Quest is a beloved series that needs no introduction and is often cherished for kickstarting the genre. This game was the beginning of a pop culture icon back in 1986 on the NES in Japan. The series eventually made itself known in the US back in 1989 under the title Dragon Warrior, which is pretty well known information. The series would over time be released and localized in America, with each following entry being a little after Japan. Now take a wild guess what was the first title that Europe received in this beloved series that literally invented the slime. I'll put a few answers here on screen, feel free to take a guess. That's right, it was the 8th game in the series. That's 20 years apart from Japan. Think of it this way, Dragon Quest, a long-running franchise that began on the NES, had its first release on the PlayStation 2 in Europe. This is insane. The game also reflects this, having them axe the E and simply titling the game Dragon Quest in PAL regions. A lot of this game's localization reflects this fact, with it being the first game in the series to be voiced and released in Europe. Most of the voice actors had British accents.
Not now. I've almost got this game in the bag.
What? You little runt! You must be cheating!
Take it easy. No need to get excited. I know it hurts when you lose and all, but...
What? Oh, I get it. You're with him!
Oi! You want to watch it? Don't go throwing accusations about. You don't want to get on my wrong side.
Take it easy, you guys. What are you, a couple of cavemen?
British?
They even hired famous British comedian and actor Ricky Groveman to voice Yangus, one of this game's main party members. They also hired John Glover, who voices King Trode and is another famous British voice actor mainly known for their role in the Doctor Who series. Thankfully, after the release of Dragon Quest VIII in Europe, previous games got ported and localized over in the region. It is really strange seeing this series release order on its official Wikipedia entry with a huge gap between European releases. It's also crazy how the PAL region received the first Dragon Quest game in 2014 on mobile devices of all things, 28 years after the original. You can't exactly really blame Europe and Australia's lack of awareness for the series today when you consider these facts. Also, a small rant, but please Square Enix, port every Dragon Quest game to modern consoles. I hate using my phone to play games, and the idea of using it to play a lengthy JRPG sounds incredibly cursed. The second-hand market is also awful when you consider how many of these games don't have ports on modern consoles. Hopefully, with the success of the Dragon Quest III remake, we'll see previous games make a comeback. Moving on to the Super Nintendo, there was a surprising amount of JRPGs we missed out on. Just as big as Dragon Quest, the Final Fantasy series took a long time to come out in PAL territories. Whilst America was enjoying the beloved 6th entry in the series, that game originally missed us on the Super Nintendo, eventually being brought over here almost 10 years later on the original PlayStation. The first Final Fantasy we received was the 7th game in the series, which everyone remembers being a huge hit in the mainstream gaming sphere back then and really pushed the genre over in the West. Thanks to the huge success of Final Fantasy VII, more titles in the genre would receive localizations over in the PAL region, but it would still take a while to really cement itself in the European video game market. My personal all-time favourite Super Nintendo game, Earthbound, which originally released in 1994, took until 2013 on the Wii U to finally be officially available over here. Granted, in this game's case, it makes sense since it was originally known for selling awfully back in the day with American audiences. This was due to many reasons, such as JRPGs not being as popular as they are now, with games like Final Fantasy VII and Pokemon releasing shortly after, proving that the genre had an audience in the West. The most obvious reason this title failed to sell well was because of the infamous advertisements this game had, with it going for 90s gross out humour which really didn't fit the actual tone the game was going for. Granted, I can understand and reason with this failed attempt, which resulted in the lack of a PAL release just because of how niche to practically non-existent the fanbase was for these kinds of games back in 1994. At least Europe and the US can share in the despair of never getting an official port of Mother 3. Moving on, another incredible game PAL regions missed out on originally was Super Mario RPG. It released a little late into the Super Nintendo's lifespan in 1996, the same year the Nintendo 64 came out. I can understand in this case why the game originally missed out on PAL regions. We had to wait until 2008 on the Wii Virtual Console to finally be able to play this game for the first time. Funnily enough, cases like Earthbound and Mario RPG missing Europe when they originally came out really affected retro game conversations a lot over here when compared to American audiences online at the time. I never hear people who grew up with the SNES where I'm from in the UK mention these titles, and some adults still don't even know they came out and that they missed out on them. The idea of a Mario game not releasing globally during the system's lifespan would never happen today, but it did back then. In Smash debates, no one over here is asking for Xeno. It's crazy, but he first appeared in PAL regions as a cameo in Superstar Saga. This must have been so confusing for players back then. At least these titles can be enjoyed today officially in Europe, which I can't say for the next few games in this video. Most people will consider the original PlayStation as the greatest JRPG machine of all time, and I'd have to agree with them on that. It came out during a period in gaming where developers were allowed to explore unique ideas and take risks, and what we ended up with was an incredible library that I'm still discovering to this day. A lot of incredible titles for various reasons skipped out on PAL regions, and without outside methods we still wouldn't have access to these JRPGs that many, including myself, would say are some of the best games ever made. Starting off, we have the cult classic action detective role-playing game Parasite Eve. Released back in 1998, Parasite Eve was a huge hit, selling over 1 million copies. This game is an extremely unique turn-based JRPG where you attack with ranged weapons in these real-time battles as you move around to dodge enemies, which wasn't very common to see back then. Throughout the adventure, you investigate this strange pandemic involving cells causing all sorts of strange mutations, such as people spontaneously combusting. The game really stood out in this genre back then, with it taking place in a real-world location with New York and during Christmas in the late 90s. The reason this game missed PAL regions is a bit of a mystery due to its commercial success and it released in a good time before the PS2 was on its way. Also, when you you factor in that we received a European version of its sequel, this fact just gets even more confusing. It's a shame too, since with the heavy focus on the narrative in these games, it wouldn't make sense for players to start with the second entry in this series. This bizarre decision of only localizing the sequel to a game has happened more than once surprisingly, and will appear later on in this video. Another cult classic PlayStation game that PAL audiences missed out on was the original Valkyrie Profile, an incredible JRPG with beautiful sprites and pixel art. We did however receive a PSP port in 2007, 8 years after the original alongside the game's sequel that same year. However, the PSP port is known for having a few downgrades, mainly when it comes to slowdown and aspect ratio issues, making images not look how they should with the forced widescreen effect. Also, the game's opening 2D anime cutscene that still looks good today was replaced with these more generic CGI cutscenes which haven't aged nearly as well. This port will be what Square Enix went on to release on modern consoles and mobile devices, with Europe never receiving the original version of the PlayStation 1 game. Moving on, Europe also never received Threads of Fate, a unique JRPG made by Squaresoft that I've recently been playing through myself and can say is another experience definitely worth your time if you have the means. This game really is unlike no other, with its unique art style and cast of fun and memorable characters that have two narratives you can choose to play through. A perfect game to play through over one weekend with it being short and sweet, but by far I've saved the Celestone mission on the PlayStation for last. Hands down my favourite game on the system, and is truly something incredible, that being the 1998 sci-fi masterpiece Xenogears. Xenogears is the definition of a cult classic, originally created by Squaresoft developers who wanted to move away from what was becoming the standard with the Final Fantasy series. Originally pitched as the concept for Final Fantasy VII but became its own project, we ended up with the game we know today. This was the first masterpiece that the incredible Tetsuya Takahashi and his team spearheaded, who will go on to create the Xenoblade series. What made Xenogears stand out among other titles in the genre was how it didn't stray away from dealing with some sensitive subject matter such as themes of philosophy, religion and mortality. It's a game that outside of being re-released on the PS3 and Vita stores in the US is desperately deserving of a modern port and a first time release over in Europe. I can't stress enough how incredible this game is, and if you ever have the chance to play this title through any means, it's worth checking out. Over onto the PlayStation 2, but still sticking with the Xeno series, back in the early 2000s, many Square Enix staff left the company in pursuit of their own vision. In particular, a lot of the team who developed Xenogears like Tetsuya Takahashi would establish Monolith Soft, who in 2003 released Xenosaga Episode 1. Once again missing PAL territories and has never seen a re-release on any platform since, Xenosaga, like its predecessor, is an incredible sci-fi JRPG series. This time set in space, the game loosely connects with Xenogears but can be enjoyed without having played the previous game. The original plan with Xenosaga was to, well, make it a saga spanning 6 games, but the scope of the project, and due to it being a not so big success, it ended up only being 3 episodes long. This game was revolutionary for its time, having a fully voiced narrative and felt very cinematic with these incredible cutscenes.
Morning, Cosmos. How do you feel?
Good morning, Xian. All systems are normal.
Of course, there's still your standard JRPG affair with dungeon exploration and turn-based combat that's been heavily improved upon since Xenogears. The Xenosaga titles is what I will consider the best that this series has to offer, even surpassing the critically beloved Xenoblade games, which makes its lack of any ports to modern systems all the more sad. That being said, in a strange twist of events, the sequel to Xenosaga, titled Episode 2, did in fact release in Europe. This time around, the original director took a step back from the project, and instead the game was published by Sony themselves of all companies over in PAL regions. As a result of this, the game is typically seen as the weakest entry in the trilogy, with these strange changes being made by Sony to make the game appeal more to the West. Such as the art style opting for more realism alongside the character designs for this release having them look more realistic with their proportions and looking less stylized from episode 1, which hasn't aged nearly as well. Also, on top of that, the main female protagonist Xion had a more minor role in this entry, with it focusing on the previous party member Junior. That being said, as the weakest entry, I would still personally consider episode 2 an incredible title. I like the newly added battle system in this game in particular. In Europe, given the big focus on the narrative, copies of episode 2 came with this DVD disc containing a summary of the previous game story, getting new players up to date with the narrative at the time. This is still one of the most baffling localization decisions ever made, especially when you consider, unlike Dragon Quest VIII Acts in the Number, in Power Regions, Episode 2 is still part of the title here. It's just basic principle, you never start with Episode 2 of a series, which is a big reason why the game failed to garner an audience over in Europe at the time. Tetsuya Takahashi will return for Episode 3, and Bandai Namco would also return to publish the game in the US and Japan. What we ended up with is what I would consider the best JRPG ever made, but it never saw the light of day in Power Regions and once again has never been re-released. But this video fortunately has a happy ending. Thanks to consoles no longer having region logs and with the advent of online distribution, access to forgotten classics like these are now easier than ever to get a hold of. Games now get worldwide releases and are localized in many more languages now than ever, which helps with their global reach. Thanks to the efforts of fans through emulation, players who originally missed out on these titles can go back and try them for the first time, finding a new audience for these forgotten classics. My only biggest wish from this video is for companies like Square Enix and Bandai Namco to keep their games ported on modern consoles and Steam. We live in an age where some of the most unimaginable games have been re-released after being in copyright hell. I'm sure this is possible for any game with the right amount of fan outcry. Also, I wanted to make this video from the perspective of someone who grew up gaming in this period and wanted to shed more light on just how many amazing 10 out of 10 games Europe really missed out on. When it comes to retro gaming discussions, these omissions are rarely brought up, if at all, so hopefully this video has given more of a perspective on the strange history of JRPGs released in Europe. But what did you think on this topic? I'm curious. Also, feel free to let me know any other games that I might have missed in the comments. Thanks for watching and have a nice rest of your day.